All right. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar today, hosted by RightRev, Neocol, and Logic.io. My name is Blake Grubbs. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Logic.io, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel-style webinar. Really excited to have the panel that we do on this session today. And today's webinar will be focused on data centricity and streamlining the quote-to-revenue process. And we have some of the foremost experts in the quote to revenue and quote to cash space on this panel today. So really excited to talk with this crew that we have. So just by way of introductions to start, our panelists here today, we have Jen Meehan, the SVP of Revenue Automation at Neocol. Neocol is a solution implementation partner, highly focused on Salesforce and partners with RightRev and Logic.io. So welcome, Jen. Excited to chat with you here today. We also have Amanda Martinez Carrillo, Senior Director of Solutions Consulting and Technology Evangelist at RightRev. Amanda, I know you and I have chatted a little bit in the past, so excited for you to share some of that knowledge on here again today. And last but certainly not least, we have Chris Hostler, Director of Product Management and Customer Experience at Logic.io. Chris, thanks for joining here. Excited to have you chat with the group here and talk through quote to revenue best practices. Just a quick housekeeping note before we introduce what we'll be talking about in more detail today. We will be following up with the recording and the slides after the webinar. So just a quick housekeeping note there. Great. Well, to introduce our topic for today, I'll kick it to the panel here in just a moment. But during the webinar here today, what we'll really be discussing is a few different things. We'll really start with talking about the challenges that are faced by RevOps and finance teams in the quote to cash and quote to revenue process, and really digging in there and learning from the experiences that the team has and the team has experienced. We'll also be working through, what are the needs for robust data accuracy and reporting, and how do you actually manage your data architecture plans to make sure that you have a really streamlined quote to revenue process when it comes to the quality of your data and the way that it flows through your different systems. And within that, we'll talk about the best practices for how do you actually start, how do you implement, and how do you actually evolve quote to cash transformation in a scalable way over time. And lastly, we'll talk about just the overall importance of data centricity and platform centricity and the benefits of consolidation, specifically within the Salesforce ecosystem, and including where RightRev and Logic.io fit into that quote to revenue process and within that consolidation strategy. So we have a lot of awesome stuff to get through today. So without further ado, we will get it started with our panel. So welcome, everyone. Excited to chat with you here. We'll kick it off with you, Jen. I'll direct the first question starting with you. Wanted to just start off broadly. What are some of the initial challenges that you see customers face when engaging with a quote to revenue project?
Thanks, Blake, and thanks for having us. I'm really excited to be chatting about this today. It's super important. It is very integral to having a successful project, and it's something that we see oftentimes our customers are just not prepared for. So really the first piece that I would say when engaging with a transformational project like this is identifying your key stakeholders. All too often we see that our clients are not identifying all of the different areas that will be impacted by this project. And I mean, even if it's just a revenue project, there's still so many other gives and takes that should be involved in that. For example, if you're looking at just your revenue team because you're implementing a RightRev or a similar solution, so we just need our revenue team to be part of this project. Well, you're missing everything upstream that impacts everything that's going into RightRev, specifically the data. You're also missing things that might come after that. So your FP&A team, or maybe your revenue team really doesn't focus on the GL. You might have a separate GL team. Maybe your audit team, maybe you have an internal audit team that needs to be involved. So identifying all of those people and making sure they're involved in the project from the very beginning. Sometimes I hear, oh, well, I want to protect this group and I don't want to burn their time. I don't want to waste their time. Then you get to the middle of the project. That group realizes that this project is happening. They realize the impact it has on them, has on their processes, has on their own data. And now you're up a creek, right? You haven't brought them in. You've got to get them up to speed. They weren't anticipating being part of this project, and it's just a mess. So don't focus on protecting the other team. That only hurts you in the end. Make sure you've got a good way to identify all of those different components that will impact that project. I'd say that's absolutely number one. Another key component that is really related to that first point is prioritizing change management. People don't do this, and then they come in and they have this new system, they have this new process, they have this whole project that's changing everything. Nobody likes change. Accountants specifically hate change. And if you're not prepared for that and you're not teeing up each step of the way in a way that really allows all of your team members to embrace the change that's happening so that you can move forward, because there's probably a really good reason you're having this project, right? It could be a business reason, or there are some pain points that you're trying to alleviate. You're trying to move out of what your current state is. Now, to get to that future state, there has to be some change. So, and enabling your teams to get to that change without seeing that pushback and really embracing it and going all in, super, super important.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's sometimes we actually think about, what brings one of these projects up, right? And it can be an impetus, like I got a new revenue officer, new revenue executive, or it's now been very hard to close the books the last few quarters. It may be some pain like that, or it might be, I missed some key areas in my last audit, and these are some things that kind of bring up a topic. Well, we need to really address this. It is a problem that perhaps serviced on the revenue side, but people start to recognize it goes throughout the business, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that brings us into something that we all chatted about when we were chatting beforehand here that kept getting brought up is around, a lot of companies think that they might be getting by with what they're doing today, right? Specifically, if they're managing in a really manual way, specifically in something like spreadsheets, right? They're managing their data, they're managing a lot of aspects of the quote to revenue process within spreadsheets, and they're getting by that way. For companies that are saying that they're managing it that way and getting by, why would you tell them it's important that they should start to think about how they're automating that process? And Amanda, I'll start with you on this one.
Thanks, Blake. Yeah, this is definitely one of, I think Jen and I are nodding our heads over here, smiling at each other, because that's the number one thing that not only did we live through ourselves, but we continue to hear. I mean, over the past 5-7 years, many companies have invested in what we call quote to revenue automation, but the reality is that it's been very siloed. And so as Jen was describing, oftentimes you just focus on one piece of the puzzle and you resort to just throwing bodies at whatever the problem you have, making up with manual processes or just data checkpoints along the way. And at the end of the day, if you're still meeting your auditor's requirements, if you're still getting your reporting out on time, you don't really make the time to think about how you can optimize or make this better. Also, part of the time is because it requires a culture shift. So what we're seeing now is we're definitely seeing a lot of companies investing in quote to cash automation or quote to revenue automation. But in the past, we've seen them want to retrofit their current process to the new technology. And somewhere along the line, they start realizing that that doesn't really work because it limits you. Oftentimes you retrofit by customizing. You want to make it work the way you need it to make it work because you're used to doing things a certain way. And this is just the lay of the land. But then sales wants to introduce a new promotion. Leadership wants to introduce a new revenue stream. And then you're stuck trying to figure out how to make up for what you don't have technology to assist you in doing. So we're also seeing a shift in investment for better data analytics and talent retention. The process that I just described burns people out like no other. So why do anything? Because in this day and age, we're getting smarter about actually burning ourselves out with 15, 16-hour days of recurring typing, of just data cleaning and reconciliation to get the numbers that we need at the end of the month. And because our leadership teams want to make informed decisions, which means they need visibility and access to information earlier on in the process. So as those investment strategies shift, I think it's also a matter of us adapting to the change and to optimizing technology to get us to a better place for our own quality of life, for our own balance, but certainly for the success of our businesses. There was something that I read recently in an Ernst & Young article, and it really referenced how successful companies are creating data-centric organization to improve every decision and every step of the way, but also the interaction between humans, because at the end of the day, we're responsible for the actions that lead to some of the topics that we're going to go into throughout this conversation today. And they're doing so by using flexible, fast evolving combination of technology and ecosystems, but also retaining their talent by providing other ways in which they can evolve within their current roles and really take their expertise to another level. So why do anything? Because at the end of the day, you are still mitigating risk. You're prone to manual errors because you're introducing burnout now more than ever, and scalability, right? You don't want to limit the way in which you allow your company to grow and scale and adapt, not just to the current challenges, but also to the future.
Amanda, I think you hit the nail on the head, especially with the human aspect of this. I mean, it's hard enough right now. I think we're all experiencing difficulties with employee retention and making sure employees are happy and they're not burnt out. And the last 2 years has, if it's taught us anything, it's that we need to take care of ourselves. And, you know, we're no good to our companies unless we're taking care of ourselves as well. But also, it's that experience of just dealing with bad processes and outdated systems. That's a driver for anyone to leave a company. But I think even just the environment we're in right now, it's even hard with the latest systems, with the best processes to hold on to employees. So that's foundational in my mind. But I mean, you just have to have that bare minimum. Nobody goes to college for 4 or 6 years to then come out of college, get a bunch of years of experience, and then, you know, 6 years later, they're still just banging away in spreadsheets. I mean, it's not what people want to do. So I definitely think there's a human component to that, the age-old question of like, why automate? And you mentioned scale as well. I mean, if you're just getting by today and things are okay, that's okay today, but do you plan to make no changes to your business? No changes in ownership in the future? No acquisitions in the future? I mean, I believe that it is every business's intent and goal to grow, and you really can't grow if your basic foundational processes are not automated. And I often hear, well, we don't need to automate revenue. That's not our problem. They take care of it. They do a great job. Meanwhile, the revenue team's just in full burnout stage, and no one realizes it. But it's also really risky. You brought up risk. I mean, I think I might be biased, but I think that revenue is the most important attribute and calculation to your financial statements. And if you have any of those, you know, compelling reasons to automate, or that might be a change in the future, then it really has to be accurate. It is such a risk otherwise.
Well, I just kind of glom on there and talk a little bit about where we started, which was spreadsheets, because it feels like there are a lot of businesses that we've seen over the last 15 years on the quoting side and configuration that just think that incorrect orders, or, you know, getting the wrong parts on an order or the wrong prices is just a cost of doing business. And that cost, of course, ends up in customer sat, poor customer sat. That also is the input to all of the data downstream, right? So when people are saying, well, you know, it works, does it really? We have a process that we've done in some kind of prospect deals where we'll walk in and get a lot of the stakeholders in the room and kind of say, all right, so many of you see this problem, but you see a different facet of it. And if we get you all kind of talking about what you see, you start to realize that, oh, this is actually a common problem and it deserves an answer. The business needs to run better. And that usually starts with some form of automation that keeps control of the data. So everybody loves Excel. That's where we all start, but unfortunately, we got to graduate.
Yeah, I think we've all spent our fair share of time in Excel, but working with the processes in the automation of those processes that you are all discussing makes a lot of sense. And I think that the two elements that you all just hit on or focused on there is the human element and the idea of scalability within there as well. And I think both of those two really contribute to my next question here, which is, what would you say to people who are listening here thinking that, the idea of truly clean data throughout your process is just not possible, right? It's nearly impossible with the current ecosystem that they have. What would you say really goes into that? And what would you say to folks who are thinking that way? And again, Amanda, I'll start with you.
Amanda, I think you might be on mute, actually.
There we go.
There we go.
Working remotely.
Much better. Much better.
Thank you. I was just saying that a lot of things come to mind, and the reality is just kind of piggybacking off of the last topic that we were just addressing is that quality data is contingent on human actions and reliable technology to quantify, fulfill, and recognize goods and services. But in my experience, whenever you share best practices to business owners and say, hey, you could potentially introduce a policy change upstream, or educate, for example, your sales reps on how to take these certain steps so that the quality of your data improves, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel by the time you have to analyze the contract or you have to recognize the revenue, right? And there's always pushback because, well, we don't own that process. We're not in those systems. We're not familiar with how they even do their process. All we see is once it's done, and our job is to recognize. Well, that's exactly what's wrong with this picture, right? And that's exactly why we came together to highlight solutions that have evolved and taken those lessons learned to provide a unified platform that really allows you to automate every single step of the way, but have that cross collaboration that allows you to marry sales and finance processes. Because coming back to the topic of data, integrated data is a valuable asset, not just for sales strategy and revenue accounting, but the visibility to provide support to your customers, to improve on your processes, to analyze if what you're selling is really, trending as you thought it would, or if you need to discontinue a certain product line and introduce a new one. The reality is that we spend the bulk of our time trying to clean up data after the fact and be reactive to the problem, rather than be open to the culture shift that allows us to introduce policy from day one. And I've worked with many sales reps in my career, and I can tell you that every single one of them has been willing and open to adapt to a process to help me as an accountant, because at the end of the day, it impacted their commissions, right? So it was just a simple conversation and an explanation about, hey, I know you're at the beginning of the process, I'm at the end of the process, but this is how it comes full circle. So why don't we collaborate? Why don't we, teach one another a few things so that I can make your life easier, you can make my life easier. But in that, we were actually improving our processes just by changing our own actions and introducing new ways to respect one another's processes. Imagine if all businesses did that, right? And I think the reason why it hasn't been possible is because all of our automation solutions are siloed across different reporting tables, and it's really hard for people to bring that together unless you intervene manually. And we introduced data checkpoints along the way. When data went from system A to B, pause. Someone like me and Jen have to pause and evaluate, did I get the right count of lines? Okay, great, check, pass it on to Chris. He's next in the process. Go continue the next step. And so while that seems to work because you feel like you have control and somewhat visibility, you're actually not optimizing the potential of what data could really represent for you as all of these technologies evolve in trying to analyze it. So, when people are thinking having clean data is nearly impossible, it's actually not. And I think, Jen, you'll probably touch up on this. When you go through an automation strategy, you have to start thinking about every single step of the way. Okay, if I had to tell a calculator to do attribute 1 plus attribute 2, where would I point it to, right? So you start kind of moving the human aspect of if I had to type in this in Excel and I hit, Control plus or whatever formula I add in there, I know exactly how to do it. But if I had to let go of that and turn it over to a system that could automate it for me, now I have to go through every single area of the process and identify ownership, identify impact, and really identify the expected outcome and the expected results all around. So, for those of you thinking that it's not possible, it is possible. It does take some work. It does take the help of experts sometimes. But at the end of the day, you are so much better for it because there's a light at the end of the tunnel that opens up a world of possibilities with automation, with technology, with, talent, career growth as well. So I'll open it up for somebody else to add to that.
I love your advice of like starting at the beginning of the process. Sales is at the beginning of the process, I'm at the end, but I have these critical fields that absolutely need to get captured properly. And it impacts me in this such and such a way. And oh, by the way, it does loop back to you and impact you financially. So that's why you care. What I see personally at Neocol is we have a lot of situations where we're doing data migrations, either data migrations for AR, data migrations for revenue contract cutover. And at that point, it's just too late for process. The change in process is great for new data going forward, but looking backwards, it is so hard. It's honestly the hardest part of any project we do, I think, both on the billing and revenue side. And it is just so hard. And one of the things that is really hard about it is that typically, and I know we keep going back to resources and collaboration, but that has to be where it starts, is identifying a really good data resource who knows your systems and can really extract the data from all the different systems you have. But then you also need someone from the accounting team who can make sense of that data and say, oh, you know what, those dates actually don't make sense for XYZ reason because they will impact my revenue schedules in such and such a way. So having that collaboration and having those two folks or those two teams really tied together is going to be so integral for that data migration activity. And it's also helpful because I think some people or some businesses come in and they say, you know what, I'm just going to I have a data team. They manage my data. I don't really need accounting to participate in that. Amanda's nodding because she's totally been through it as well. And it's just such a miss because then you start getting into situations like even just the completeness. From an AR perspective, the population of data for your data migration is completely different from the population of data that you need for migrating revenue contracts. But how would that data team know that without having the guidance from the accounting team? And how would the accounting team know where all the data is or know the most efficient way to capture all that data without getting that from the data team? So I do see in the most successful data migrations and revenue contract cutovers, I see those teams working hand in hand. I see automations for the reconciliation for the revenue team happening from the data team. And just that handoff is so nice. That's where you're going to be most successful with cleaning up your historical data. But completely agree, Amanda, with your perspective of, if you want to change your data going forward, you have to change your process.
Yeah, one of the common threads that I just heard you both touch on in your responses there was this idea of kind of uniting the beginning of the process and in the sales process with the very end of the process all the way through Revrec, right? And the importance or the impact, I should say, that one has on the other. So I wanted to loop back to that for a minute. And Haas, I'll start this question with you. Why is it important from your perspective for companies to be thinking about how their product and revenue data is really flowing downstream from the very beginning of the quoting process and the solution configuration process all the way through until the end of the quote to revenue process?
Sure. Well, I think if a CPQ project kind of starts with the intention of shoring up something in sales, it shouldn't be too much further down the line when you realize that, well, the only reason to sell anything is to get revenue recognized. That is just what businesses do. That's how salespeople get paid, and that's actually how we continue on. So it's part of the whole lifeblood of the business to actually understand, well, this is the way I want to go to market, and that's actually how I actually have to recognize the revenue. And what we've seen is, when standard industrial manufacturing companies started to start offering services or the good as a service, all of a sudden the recognition of that had to change. Or we have hardware companies that are offering warranties and service and software. You basically have to have the end in mind as you are quoting it to the customer, so that you know when actually you can recognize that revenue as it goes through. That needs to be known up front. As Jen mentioned a few minutes ago, there are certain pieces of data that you need to know. Where is this going to be installed? When is it going to be installed? That is important to Revrec. And if you don't know that immediately when you're first talking to the customer, it's data that you later are going to have to come in when the order is pushed. So it's kind of understanding how you interact with the customer, how you want to move from customer problem to the solution that you want to present, and also how do you gather that data along the way that helps the back office systems actually do the real work.
Makes sense. Jen or Amanda, do you have anything to add there?
I think Chris captured it really well. The only thing I would add is that from what we see in projects is sometimes teams don't think about how the data that they're managing impacts the next team. And I think that's a common thread that we're hearing today. And it's just really important to say, where does this go after, and do they have everything they need? And to be forward looking. So if you're the revenue team and you're looking at the quoting process, being communicative and saying, okay, this is what's important to me. And when you don't do that, this is how it impacts our team. This is how it impacts the business. So it's really important, because if you get anything wrong within that process, it's going to impact every team that touches that piece of data thereafter.
Right. Absolutely. So that brings me to yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, let me add just a few more comments there, because these are great topics that always bring me back to policy. The reason why all of these actions are so important, and the communication that Jen just described, and the relationship of what we call upstream to downstream in terms of like products and booking and all of that, is because there is a policy that needs to be followed in terms of how revenue is allocated across agreements, for example, that include multiple offerings. And so there are certain policies that also need to be considered. And oftentimes we think of those as after the fact, after the revenue team looks at it, let's figure out how to, check off the policy list. But you can actually configure that same policy and attach it to the same products, to the same product categories, to the same type of downstream data flow that was just being described, so that it's actually streamlined from end to end. So I would just throw in policy as another consideration here.
Yeah, that's an important element to keep in mind. And I think again, a common area that I'm picking up on throughout all of your responses there is this idea of alignment, right? And this idea of preparation as well, right? And I think that one thing, and Jen, I'll direct this to you to start. I think the one thing that we hear implementers talk about and stress all the time is the importance of preparation, and how you can actually work to get ahead of these issues before it becomes before it starts to snowball. So can you talk about if there are particular ways that companies can start to really get ahead of these challenges to ensure that they have clean data throughout the process, like we just talked about, prior to an implementation?
Yep, definitely. And it's the probably number one thing that I would suggest doing if you have a ramp time in between when you've determined a project is going to start and when the project actually starts. I would definitely start looking at your data. This is going to mean different things for different people, though. And one thing that will be the same throughout any business is your data needs to be complete and it needs to be accurate. If you talk to any auditor, any accountant, they will tell you the same thing. Completeness is pretty easy to capture. Do I have all of, and let me back up a second. First, you want to identify some critical fields, right? These critical fields are going to be different across any business. Once you've identified your critical fields, and that's again in collaboration with everyone along the quote to revenue process, I've got my critical fields. Now I can check for completeness. Am I missing a majority of data within, especially thinking about the historical? My historical data, is any of that missing? The reason I say it means different things to different people is if you look at some specific things like list price, for example, that's a big one for the revenue world. Amanda probably sees this a lot where, list price is really, really important in order to have your revenue right because of SSP allocations. Your SSP might be based off of list price, but it's not always. So we have some customers who are implementing RightRev. They don't even need list price. It doesn't impact them at all. So you really have to determine what matters to your business, what matters to your entire process. A lot of times you're going to have custom fields that are just specific to your business. Maybe term for convenience is a really revenue impacting field. So do you have that identified in a proper way where a system can consume that and create automations off of that data? And at the end of the day, that's really what your aim is by cleaning up this data is, can I systematize it later? Is it in a good enough state where a system, not a person who has judgment capabilities, a system can take that data, apply rules to it, and give you the output that you're expecting. And cleaning that data, again, I'm going to go back to that collaboration effort between your data team and your accounting teams. It has to be a collaborative effort. It has to come from both sides.
Absolutely. Amanda or Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and add to that. It actually brought me back to the quote, right? Everything that you're just describing, Jen. What I would want to leave, finance users with is pay more attention to quotes and quoting data and those early agreement features, because we tend to be so siloed that we don't really care sometimes, or we think of quotes as just this preliminary estimate that may or may not happen. And oftentimes, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are solutions out there that kind of begin with this, like almost a playground. Hey, look at all these things that you can bring in. Let's give flexibility to your sales reps. You can build whatever offering you want. And we give so much flexibility from a technology standpoint. But when it's not tied to policy, or when the people implementing those pieces of the puzzle don't realize the downstream impact that it could have to just merge a bunch of products that may or may not be sold together or recognized together, or may require something else, even for purposes of billing frequency and charge types, etc. That's where we're having to be reactive. So pay more attention to quotes, not from a let's be a gatekeeper and monitor and police everything that's on a quote, but to really understand the flexibility that is needed to marry the policy and the automation that you're looking for to that same process, and vice versa, right? On the sales operations, the teams that own the quoting and ordering process, pay attention to the downstream impact so that you're not constantly having to be the one to help someone reverse engineer a project, or help someone recalculate someone's commission, or restate the revenue for a specific contract or a line of business. It all goes hand in hand. So, stressing the importance of clean data follows all of the different processes, right? And it all culminates in reporting and being able to recreate that process for your auditors without them having to spend as much time as you spent trying to do it yourself, because that costs you more money in the end. So
yeah, I'm glad you actually mentioned that, Amanda, because sales is an inherently chaotic kind of exercise. And when you start talking about like accounting, that is a very, there are set definitions and things fit in certain places. And all of a sudden we're talking about how we go from the chaos to actually running a business. And I would say that if a quoting and configuration system does nothing else, I mean, it's great to kind of have the playground and all that sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, they actually need to have something that can be validly sold together, built and manufactured, because otherwise you're going to end up, going back around and redoing it. So yeah, the quoting is great. It's all about, helping the sales rep or the customer find their own solution. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter unless it fits into the systems that go downstream.
Great. Well, I think this has been a super insightful and super valuable conversation. I want to flip it over and get some questions from the audience now. But real quick, while those come in, I just want to flash this up on the screen to show if you're interested in chatting with with Chris or Amanda or Jen or any of their other teammates here, you have their contact information up here to go and actually interact with us, reach out to us. Feel free to ask questions, and I'm sure that any of the team here would be willing to have a conversation if you're interested in learning more about how any of these three solutions can, in service providers, can help with your quote to revenue processes. So we will take a few questions from the audience here. The first one here on the list looks like it will be directed towards Jen. So Jen, do solution implementers also offer some kind of advisory services to help customers determine what their data architecture should look like?
Yes, absolutely. And it's something I would actually highly recommend, especially if you're looking at a transformational quote to revenue project. What we often see is, teams will get really excited, businesses will get really excited. Oh, we're part of this big transformation project. They kick it right off, and they were not ready to kick off. They should not have kicked off. They should not have started. There was so much work that they needed to do before, and so much evaluation that they needed to do, and it just didn't happen, because what we find is that accounting teams don't do this all the time. It's not part of their day-to-day. Most accounting teams, if I did a survey right now, most people on accounting teams would not have already been involved in a system implementation. So there's a lot that needs to happen before you get to that point. Data is a big piece, of course, that was our main focus today, but it's also looking at what your technical architecture looks like. Does it make sense for you to add X, Y, Z to the end of your process? Do you need to actually add something on before? Do you need a reporting tool to deal with all of your data? And that's obviously something that Neocol is happy to help with. And it's, again, in these huge transformational projects, it's absolutely something that I would recommend.
Great. We have another question that just came in, and I think it's related to the previous conversation that we were having around the quoting aspect of the process. So, Chris, I'll direct this towards you. With the rise of omni-channel and self-service quoting and transacting, what are some of the most important factors to consider when looking for a solution that offers flexibility as the world shifts to more of a self-service motion?
Sure. So the first, of course, is to make sure that whatever you're choosing can handle those different channels. I think many solutions cannot because they were built in a time where you didn't need to have these multiple channels, or it was less of a priority than it is today. But once you've identified your channels and a vendor that can handle those channels, you're going to start being very worried about cost, because you don't want to stand up something unique for each channel. You want to basically be able to build it once and reuse it. At Logic, the idea behind Logic is that you would actually be able to write the logic once that controls how different things are sold, different things fit together for a direct sales team, and also for a self-serve website. Maybe the same thing for a partner portal, and it's just tweaks on the same basic infrastructure that are going to be able to handle all these different channels at the same time. And part of this actually moves back into the topic that we were talking about today, is if you have one central system that is guiding all of these channels and gathering information in all these channels, you can ensure that the downstream processes, no matter how an order came in, is actually going to be able to be recognized. And that's essential. So the idea is, you use one system across all those different channels, and you will be able to rely on that one system for clean data, no matter which channel the information came in through.
Great. Looks like we have time for one more question here. Amanda, I'll direct this one towards you. What are the benefits of using a Revrec automation solution that is designed outside of the ERP?
It's a great question. Always one of my favorite topics to talk about. In the spirit of talking about data centricity and platform centricity, that's a great question, right? The number one thing that I like to highlight is that the role of the ERP is not going away. ERPs were designed for very specific functions, some of which are very robust and best in breed, for example, fulfillment, and even for accounting. There are a lot of solutions out there that have taken over bits and pieces of it. But at the end of the day, when you have a large enterprise that's on an ERP like an Oracle or an SAP or any of the other ones that are out there, you've baked in so much of your process that it's really hard to take it out of there. When it comes to revenue, some of these solutions have introduced their own features for revenue management. However, in this ecosystem that we're describing, where revenue management depends on more than just what's been billed or what's been booked so that I can recognize it. I have to focus on what's in my quoting data, what's in my billing frequency, what about consumption, volume, all this other activity. You're looking for flexibility to allow you to capture all of those different revenue streams upstream. So that's one reason why revenue automation solutions that exist out of the ERP are often chosen, is because of that upstream flexibility that you need to configure all of the different things that Jen and Chris, for example, have described today. But when it comes to the actual accounting of it, what's baked into a traditional ERP oftentimes follows old ways of recognizing revenue, which oftentimes just follows an invoice. Once you invoice, that's when you recognize revenue. And some do have flexibility to recognize independent of an invoice. But then the reality is that there's always more complexity for when contracts are changed, amended, canceled, for when you are wanting to co-term contracts, for when you are having to allocate revenue. And then if you do introduce an amendment and a co-term, how do you recalculate those revenue allocations? There's just so much more complexity that has been designed into revenue automation solutions like RightRev, for example, that are not only compliant, but realize that at the end of the day, the principle is open up to interpretation, and every single revenue stream is going to have a downstream impact that is going to require flexibility, but also a way to marry the sales and finance data end to end to then put together the journal entries that ultimately go back to the ERP. So all of that flexibility that you need upstream and while you're doing the management is the reason why you definitely want to consider an automation solution and the value that these solutions bring outside of the ERP, but they still work with the ERP hand in hand, allowing you to summarize the data for posting, for example. You no longer have to send thousands and thousands of lines to your GL and then find a way to consolidate it and aggregate it later. You can summarize the data and send it just by account or have very strategic ways to transfer the information. So that's one of the main reasons that I would like to highlight.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. Well, thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Chris. I think that's all the time that we have for questions here. If there are any other questions that came in during the session that we did not get to, we will follow up on those, no worries. But I thought that this was a great session, so thank you again to our panelists. This has been great. And just to kind of sum up some of the key takeaways that I think that I got out of this, one is around preparation for change, right? And preparation for consolidation and the importance of that. And within that process, really the ability to look holistically at your quote to revenue process from beginning to end, and making sure that you're really taking that end-to-end view and understanding the impact that each step has on each and every other team and department and part of your quote to revenue process. And then lastly, and I think we hit on this in kind of the audience Q&A quite a bit there, is that there really is no one size fits all solution, right? It's important to understand what solution is best for where your business is at in terms of the stage of maturity. So really important to dig in, make sure that you have the right expertise that you're partnering with or that you have internally to make sure that you're choosing the right solutions for your business and setting yourself up for success. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much.